July 6, 1953. Lieutenant Thomas Harold stands in a trench on a hill in central Korea, and he knows something that makes his job almost impossible. In exactly 21 days, an armistice will be signed. The war will be over. The hill he's standing on, Pork Chop Hill, will be abandoned, given back to the Chinese as part of the final negotiated line. Everything he's about to do, every order he's about to give, every man who's about to die defending this position, it's all for nothing, and he has to lead them anyway. Welcome to the most frustrating, infuriating, and tragically pointless battle of the Korean War. You know about Pork Chop Hill. You've probably seen the movie. But I'm going to tell you what that movie doesn't fully capture: the absolute absurdity of men fighting and dying for a piece of ground that both sides knew was worthless. This isn't a story about heroism, though there was plenty of that. This is a story about what happens when politics takes priority over the lives of the men doing the fighting. Let me set the scene. It's 1953. Peace talks have been dragging on at Panmunjom for 2 years. 2 years of negotiating while men keep dying. The talks have stalled over prisoner exchanges, over where the demarcation line should be, over a dozen technical details. And while the diplomats argue, the war continues in this bizarre stalemate where everyone knows it's almost over, but nobody knows exactly when. Pork Chop Hill gets its name because, from the air, it supposedly looks like a pork chop. It's Hill 255 on the military maps. It sits in front of the main U.S. defensive line, an outpost position about a mile ahead of the MLR, the main line of resistance. Tactically, it's not particularly important. It doesn't control any vital terrain. It's not blocking any invasion routes. It's just a hill. But it's American-held territory, and in the summer of 1953, that's all that matters. Here's what makes this insane. By July 1953, everyone, and I mean everyone, knows roughly where the armistice line is going to be. The negotiators have essentially agreed on it. Pork Chop Hill is going to end up on the Chinese side of that line. It will be abandoned, handed over. The men fighting for it know this. The officers know this. Hell, even some of the Chinese soldiers attacking it probably know this. But the order comes down anyway: hold Pork Chop Hill at all costs. Why? Because of the peace talks. The logic, if you can call it that, goes like this. If we abandon Pork Chop Hill before the armistice is signed, it shows weakness at the negotiating table. The Chinese will think we're soft, that we're desperate for peace, and they'll demand more concessions. So men have to die to prove we're not desperate. Men have to bleed to maintain the appearance of strength. It's not about military strategy. It's about diplomatic posturing. Lieutenant Colonel William Kern commanded the 31st Infantry Regiment sector that included Pork Chop. In a letter he wrote years later, a letter that wasn't declassified until the 1980s, he's brutally honest about the situation. He writes, "We were ordered to hold terrain we knew we'd surrender within weeks. I had to look my men in the eye and tell them to defend a position that had no military value. That's a hell of a thing to ask of soldiers." The Chinese attack on Pork Chop begins on the night of July 6th. It's not the first battle for this hill. There was a vicious fight in April too, but this is the big one, the final one. The Chinese commit 2 full regiments, maybe 6,000 men, against the 96 American soldiers holding the outpost. The artillery barrage that precedes the assault is absolutely devastating. In 30 minutes, the Chinese drop more than 3,000 shells on a position that's maybe 300 yards across. Sergeant First Class Ola Mize is in the command bunker when the barrage hits. He later described it as the most intense artillery he experienced in the entire war, and this is a man who'd been fighting since 1950. He said the bunker was shaking so violently that equipment was falling off the walls. The sound was beyond description, a continuous roar that made communication impossible. And then, when it stopped, you knew what was coming next. The Chinese infantry hits the hill from 3 sides. They're using the same tactics they've used throughout the war: mass assault, overwhelming numbers, accepting heavy casualties to break through. And it works. Within an hour, Chinese troops are all over Pork Chop Hill. The American defenders are fighting from bunkers, from trenches, hand to hand in some places. It's chaos. Here's where it gets really ugly. The American commanders have to decide, do we counterattack? Do we send reinforcements? Or do we cut our losses and abandon a position we're going to abandon anyway in 3 weeks? The debates happening at battalion and regimental headquarters are heated. Some officers are arguing that it's not worth more American lives. Others are arguing that abandoning it now would be worse for morale and negotiations than losing men to hold it. The decision comes from higher up. 8th Army Command says hold pork chop, not because it matters militarily but because it matters politically. So reinforcements are ordered forward. Company E, 17th Infantry Regiment gets the call. They're going to counterattack to retake the hill. The men know what they're walking into. Some of them have been on pork chop before. They know it's a killing ground. Lieutenant Harold, the officer I mentioned at the beginning, leads one of the platoons going up. He assembled his men before the counterattack, and according to several soldiers who were there, he was honest with them. He didn't sugarcoat it. He told them the hill wasn't strategically important. He told them they were going because orders were orders. And then he said something that stuck with the survivors. We're going to do our job because that's what soldiers do. But don't think for a second that this makes sense. The counterattack goes in after midnight. The Chinese have fortified the positions they captured. They've got machine guns set up in the same bunkers the Americans built. It's brutal, close-quarters combat. Grenades in bunkers, bayonets, entrenching tools used as weapons. The kind of fighting that's absolutely primal and terrifying. Private First Class Robert Schutz was part of that counterattack. In an oral history interview recorded in the 1990s, he described what it was like moving up that hill in the dark. Artillery is falling. Both sides are shelling the hill simultaneously. You can't tell which explosions are friendly and which are enemy. The noise is disorienting. Men are screaming, some calling for medics, some just screaming. You're climbing over bodies, American and Chinese, some dead, some dying. And you keep moving forward because stopping means dying. The fighting goes on for hours. By dawn on July 7th, parts of pork chop are back in American hands, but the Chinese still hold key positions, so more reinforcements are sent. Company K goes up, then elements of the 17th Infantry. The hill becomes a meat grinder. Men are fighting for the same bunkers that changed hands 3, 4, 5 times in a single night. Sergeant Mize, the one who survived the initial barrage, performs actions during this battle that will later earn him the Medal of Honor. He single-handedly takes out multiple Chinese positions, rescues wounded soldiers under fire, holds a sector of the line by himself for hours. His citation reads like something from a movie. But when he talked about it later, he always came back to the same point. Brave men died for a hill we gave away 3 weeks later. Here's the part that should make you furious. While this is happening, while men are dying on Pork Chop Hill, the negotiators at Panmunjom are arguing about the size of the font on the armistice documents. That's not an exaggeration. There are records of the peace talks from July 7th through 10th, 1953, and they're debating procedural minutiae while the battle rages. The disconnect is staggering. By July 8th, the situation on Pork Chop is desperate. The Chinese have reinforced again. They're committing more troops because they know the same thing the Americans know. This is about appearances. If they take Pork Chop, they go to the peace table having won the last battle. If the Americans hold it, America claims the psychological victory. So both sides keep feeding men into the grinder. Colonel Kern is getting casualty reports throughout the day. The numbers are climbing, killed, wounded, missing, and he's being told to hold at all costs. He later admitted that he came close to refusing the order, not because he wasn't willing to fight. He was a career officer, a combat veteran, but because he couldn't justify the casualties for a position with no value. But orders are orders, and he complies. The fighting continues for 3 more days. July 9th, July 10th, July 11th. The hill changes hands partially or fully multiple times. The artillery fire is continuous. Both sides are expending massive amounts of ammunition on this one small piece of ground. The Chinese are losing hundreds of men. The Americans are losing dozens, which in the context of an outpost battle is catastrophic. Finally, on July 11th, the decision is made at 8th Army Headquarters: abandon Pork Chop Hill. Not because the Chinese won, the Americans still technically hold parts of it, but because the casualty rate is unsustainable for a position that will be surrendered anyway. The order goes out: withdraw under cover of darkness. Leave the hill to the Chinese. The withdrawal happens that night. The surviving defenders pull back to the MLR. They leave behind their dead, dozens of them, because there's no time to recover bodies under fire. They leave behind equipment, weapons, fortifications, everything they fought for, everything their buddies died for. They leave it all and walk away. Here are the numbers, and they should break your heart. The Americans suffered approximately 243 killed, wounded, or missing during the final battle for Pork Chop Hill. The Chinese casualties were much higher. Estimates range from 1,500 to 2,000. So combined, maybe 2,200 men killed or wounded fighting for a hill that was abandoned 16 days before the armistice was signed. Let that sink in. 16 days. If the order to withdraw had come on July 6th instead of July 11th, all those casualties could have been avoided. The outcome of the war would have been exactly the same. The armistice line would have been exactly the same, but hundreds of men would have lived. The survivors of Pork Chop carried this with them for the rest of their lives. In reunions, in interviews, in letters, the same theme comes up over and over. We did our duty, we fought bravely, but it was for nothing. Lieutenant Harold, who survived the battle, gave a speech at a Korean War veterans event in 1983, 30 years later, and he said something that captured it perfectly. We proved we could hold that hill. We proved we could fight, but we didn't prove it was worth the cost. Here's what makes this even more bitter. Pork Chop Hill isn't unique. It's just the most famous example of a pattern that defined the last year of the Korean War. There were dozens of outpost battles like this. Old Baldy, The Hook, T-Bone Hill, all of them fought while peace talks dragged on, all of them for marginal tactical positions, all of them ultimately abandoned or rendered meaningless by the armistice line. The men fighting these battles knew what was happening. They weren't stupid. They could read newspapers. They knew the war was ending, but they were soldiers, and soldiers follow orders, even when those orders don't make sense. Especially when those orders don't make sense. That's the nature of military service. You trust that someone up the chain of command has the bigger picture, that your sacrifice serves a purpose. But at Pork Chop Hill, that trust was betrayed. Not by the immediate commanders. Men like Colonel Kern were just as frustrated as the troops, but by the system. By a military and political leadership that valued negotiating position over human life. By a mindset that said we can't show weakness, even if showing strength costs American blood. There's a Chinese perspective on this too, though it's less documented. The Chinese soldiers attacking Pork Chop were in the same boat. They were ordered to take a hill that they'd probably have to give back eventually. Their commanders were under pressure to show strength at the negotiating table too. So young Chinese soldiers, many of them conscripts, many of them teenagers, died for the same pointless political theater. After the armistice was signed on July 27, 1953, the demarcation line was surveyed and marked. Pork Chop Hill ended up about 1,000 yards north of the final line, on the Chinese side, just like everyone knew it would be. Today, if you could visit the site, and you can't, it's in the DMZ, you'd find nothing but overgrown trenches and rusted barbed wire. No monument, no marker, just forgotten ground that men died fighting for. The Korean War is sometimes called the Forgotten War, and battles like Pork Chop Hill are why. It's hard to mythologize a battle where the men fighting knew they were fighting for nothing. It doesn't fit the narrative we like to tell about war: noble sacrifice, strategic necessity, fighting for freedom. Pork Chop Hill was none of those things. It was political calculation with a human cost. Sergeant Mize, the Medal of Honor recipient, lived until 2014. In one of his last interviews, he was asked if he was proud of his actions at Pork Chop Hill. He said yes, he was proud of doing his duty and helping his fellow soldiers. But then he was asked if the battle was worth it. He paused for a long time before answering. Finally, he said, "War is never worth it, but sometimes it's necessary. Pork Chop Hill wasn't necessary. That's the difference." That's the truth about Pork Chop Hill that the movies and the history books often miss. It wasn't a heroic last stand. It wasn't a crucial battle that turned the tide of the war. It was a tragedy born of political stubbornness and military pride. It was men doing their jobs, fighting bravely, sacrificing greatly, for nothing. The soldiers who fought there deserved better. They deserved commanders who valued their lives more than negotiating leverage. They deserved a political system that would end a war when it needed to end, not drag it out for diplomatic appearances. They deserved to come home without having to wonder why their friends died for a hill that was abandoned 16 days later. But they didn't get what they deserved. They got orders. They got Pork Chop Hill. And they did their duty anyway because that's what soldiers do. They fight the battles they're given, even the pointless ones, especially the pointless ones. So the next time someone mentions Pork Chop Hill, remember this. It wasn't about courage, though there was plenty of that. It wasn't about tactics, though the fighting was fierce. It was about the cost of pride, the cost of not wanting to appear weak, the cost of letting politics drive military decisions, and that cost was paid in American and Chinese blood for a hill that nobody wanted and nobody kept. July 6 through 11th, 1953, 5 days of brutal combat, hundreds of casualties, all for a hill that was abandoned before the month ended. That's Pork Chop Hill. That's the truth. And that's something we should never forget because the men who fought there never could.